I am pleased to introduce our special guest, Morris Flewwelling. While Morris is well known in our community and the museum world in Alberta, Canada, and internationally, it is important to speak on who he is and why we invited him. Morris Flewwelling was raised in a position of privilege in central Alberta. He grew up in a household that instilled citizenship and community, with food on the table, where he had access to education and books, and the library were encouraged. Morris readily acknowledges that belonging to the cultural majority ensured that he had an easy access to resources, opportunities, and ease of fitting in wherever he went. Morris earned his Bachelor of Education from the University of Alberta, where he went on to have a 20-year career in education, where he started the first alternative school in Alberta. Then he started his second 20-year career when he became the executive director of our museum, the Red Deer Museum and Art Gallery. He would go on to found the Heritage Community Foundation, Central Alberta Regional Museum Network, and be on the board for the Alberta Museums Association, as well as the Canadian Museum Association. He was mayor in Red Deer from 2004 to 2013, and one of the many honors he had in his position was to be an official witness during the 3 Truth and Reconciliation events that took place in our city. When we talk about this and we talk about the early days, Morris was here in the early days of our museum and the early days of community museums. And many community museum and history museums that were started in and around 1967 and beyond. And a lot of them were prairie-based, telling the story of the community museums. But most of them did not include any meaningful representation of Indigenous peoples.
Right.
Apart from the Glenbow and the Luxton. So the Glenbow in Calgary and the Luxton in Banff. And Red Deer was actually one of the last communities to have a museum started in their region. But from the ground, or from the very beginning, through Morris's leadership, we actually started collecting items from the Indigenous cultures. So, for example, one of our very first objects to come in were a pair of moccasins. The museum helped when the archaeological digs took place at Fort Normandeau, Waskesiu Park, and the Red Deer Indian Industrial Site. One of the coolest things that came into the museum was when there was an excavation here in Red Deer along the Red Deer River, and a stone bowl.
Absolutely. The stone bowl was brought in by a young fellow one day. He said he was walking his dog out amongst some landfill dumps out by the sewage treatment plant, and he stumbled across this and he didn't know what it was, so he brought it in. I recognized right away that it was a mortar. We conjectured as to how it might have got to Red Deer. I was going to Ottawa one time, so I took it with me to the Canadian Conservation Institute, and they took some starch grains out of the bottom of it and discovered through research that it is 6,400 years old. And they determined that it had come from interior British Columbia. It's dark green nephrite, and it was brought here on the trade route that comes through the Kootenays and through the Kootenay Plains, and obviously to Red Deer as a trade good. So it's the oldest stone worked piece in Alberta.
Which is quite remarkable. And even if I could show you guys the heft of this, that's quite impressive too. The other pieces that came into our collection that were really significant in the 80s was the Dr. Kathleen Anderson Swallow collection.
Right. 153 pieces of Indigenous artwork, including Inuit pieces that had come via the Charles Camsell Hospital.
And those are remarkable because she also, when she passed away, she left a bequest.
Which we used to add pieces to the collection, so it's now about 200 pieces.
Her friend, she convinced her friend, or did you convince her friend, Genevieve Morrow, to participate?
Genevieve Morrow was the wife of Commissioner Morrow from the Northwest Territories, and during his commission there, they were gifted a number of wonderful pieces, and she decided that the total best repository would be the museum in Red Deer, where it could join the Swallow collection. So the Genevieve Morrow collection joined the Swallow collection, and we have a lovely items of clothing and printed fabric and prints and artworks and carvings, all from all throughout the north.
And that narwhal tusk that we
Yes.
have was Genevieve Moreau's.
Yes, it was.
Unusual for a museum in central Alberta.
Absolutely exotic. And what was interesting was when I was first asked by Dr. Swallow if we would like her Inuit collection. As a museum person, I had to say to myself, what sense does a collection of Inuit and Indigenous artifacts, First Nations pieces, mean to central Alberta? It was such exotic material at the time. Remember, this is in the early 70s or the early 80s. And I said, no, this belongs here because Dr. Swallow was a resident and she collected that stuff. And then the Morrow collection simply amplified the core of the Swallow collection. So that's how Red Deer in central Alberta has this absolutely wonderful collection of northern material. It's exotic to us, but it was seen as exotic by the people who gifted it to the museum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. We also, within that, we also have kind of on the opposite stream of it is the Hugh Bauer Archaeology collection and geological collections. I think there's like 2,000 stones and bones and
there must be
tools.
because when I went to collect that material from Mr. Bauer, he had it in his garage in his basement in grape boxes and cardboard boxes and bags and so on. The unfortunate part of that collection is we only know the land where Mr. Bauer owned, and he collected it on the land, but we know no other information to go with that. But there are some significant pieces in that collection as well.
Well, and just the breadth of them says this land was really well used.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. A crossroads of the Indigenous people.
Exactly. And then in the, I'm not going to say the late 80s, but around 87, 88, you guys started working on an exhibit called Where the Old Man Slept. And within this exhibit, you guys also at that time hired Lyle Kuwait Richards to start working with the elders in our community. And when you worked on The Old Man Slept, I believe there was 20 plus Indigenous elders from the Muskowitchis Reserve that were asked to participate and participated in the research and development of this exhibition.
We realized that when we undertook Where the Old Man Slept, that we really were on new territory. We didn't know what we were doing. And so we looked to them as experts. And it got right down to the fine point, because when we put the exhibit together based on what they told us about the dog days of the Indigenous people on the prairies, we decided that we would do the panels and the exhibit labels in English, French, and Cree syllabics. And that was, I believe, a first in Canada, where Cree syllabics were used to identify the material. And in order to get those Cree syllabics, we had to rely on the elders at Maskwacis to take our text and panels and translate it as best they could. And so it was a real step forward. And that exhibit stood for at least 15 years in the collections here.
Which it was really interesting when you guys were working on The Old Man Slept. There was happenings, an hour and a half south of us. The Calgary Winter Olympics was happening, the Glenbow exhibition, The Spirit Sings, the Artistic Practices of Canada's First People, that was funded by Shell. Can you tell us about that time period? Because I believe you were on the CMA or president of the CMA.
President of the CMA. That's a very interesting piece of my museum career. In fact, it was clearly the most significant work that I was involved in museums in 2 decades. What happened with the Spirit Sings, the artistic tradition of Canada's First Peoples, was a huge exhibit mounted by Glenbow as the sort of cornerstone artistic exhibit of the Calgary Olympics in 1988. And Glenbow went all out. They borrowed material from all over the world. They had 650 artifacts in the exhibit. It was huge. Julia Harrison was the curator, and she was a really dedicated and hard worker to the whole event. However, unfortunately for Glenbow, the whole thing blew up. And it blew up because the Lubicon First Nation people in northern Alberta were struggling with their land claims, which only recently have been settled. And at the same time, Shell Oil was the key funder for the huge exhibition, The Spirit Sings. And the Lubicon First Nations was struggling with the invasion of Shell Oil drilling on their lands. So they decided, the Lubicons decided, that they could get international coverage by going and protesting the exhibit at the Olympics, because they knew there was Olympic coverage going all over the world, and this was a part. So they mounted really, really loud and colorful protests in Calgary at where the Spirit Sings. And it's interesting that this involved some really interesting leaders at the time. Duncan Cameron was the great guru of the Glenbow. Joe Clark was representing Calgary South. The mayor of Calgary was Ralph Klein, who later became the premier of Alberta. And Colleen Klein, who's just recently passed, was of Métis extraction. And so there was all of this foment around the Indigenous people and the Spirit Sings and so on. It was very embarrassing for Glenbow because they tried to do the right thing, and it falls into the category that no good deed goes unpunished. And they took a lot of knocks over that. And the statement that came out of it by the Indigenous people was, if we share the flame, we share the blame, and we share the shame. And that became the rallying cry. And so it was very, very unfortunate. The exhibit went on to Ottawa, where it was mounted, and of course the political sensitivities in Ottawa were amplified. And the Mohawks filed a court injunction to have artifacts removed because they said the artifacts have spirits. And there was one particular mask that there was huge controversy about. And so it was a very, very tense situation. And as president of the CMA, representing the museum community, we were kind of embarrassed by the whole thing, and what could we do? Yeah. And so quickly we decided to form a conference to bring together the museum community and the Indigenous community. So we mounted a conference in November. The exhibit Spirit Sings had opened in Calgary on January the 6th, 1988. By November, we had a conference organized with help from the Assembly of First Nations, National Chief George Erasmus, and National Chief Phil Fontaine, and Dr. George MacDonald, who was the head of the Canadian Museums Civilization. We mounted this exhibit, or this conference rather, in Ottawa to bring together the two solitudes, to talk about the importance of cultural objects in museums and how they're handled and what to do about them. And so it had all the big names. I mean, Dr. George MacDonald, Phil Fontaine, Bill Byrne from Alberta, Ovid Mercredi, Reg Crowshoe.
No.
I mean, it was all the people in the museum world and all the people who were leaders in the Assembly of First Nations. And so
that must have been quite the place.
It was very intense. We had about 200 people come to the conference, and nobody knew what was going to happen, but we all knew it was tense. And so during that conference, we talked about involvement of First Nations in interpretation by museums. In other words, if museums were going to tell the story, well, tell the story from the Indigenous perspective. Improved access to collections. Indigenous people did not feel comfortable in museum collections. They weren't invited in to see them. And yet it was the material from their culture.
Yeah.
Employment opportunities for First Nations people in museums, and training for people in First Nations in museums. In those days, there was very little training for anybody, but there was absolutely none for First Nations people. And the biggest thing was repatriation of artifacts. See, the museum collections had been built up by anthropologists and people who were interested in the exotica of the museum cultural pieces. And so the material got into museums and was taken away from the Indigenous people, and of course increased funding for museums. The final piece was, how does this play out internationally? Because Canada is not the only colonized part of the world. You've got the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, almost all of East Africa, almost all of West Africa. These were colonized in the grand days of empire, and they all were struggling with this very same thing. I mean, today we still are talking about the Benin bronzes that came out of Nigeria, and there's great repatriation occurring, and so on and so forth. So out of it, the biggest issue that came out of all that discussion, and it was very, very fertile discussion, was that there should be a task force formed to study and refine and recommend the way forward for museums and First People. So that resulted in the formation of a task force called Turning the Page, a task force on museums and First Peoples. And that was formed in 1989, and they gave their report 2 years later in 1992. It was all about forging new partnerships between museums and Indigenous people, because, as you mentioned in your introduction, our settler museums that had been formed in most communities did not acknowledge with any fullness the Indigenous prehistory period in their area. Now, if we had the cream of the museum community and the Assembly of First Nations community involved in the conference, well, we translated that into the task force. So the task force was set up with the late Tom Hill as one of the co-chairs. And Tom at that time was head of the Woodland Cultural Center in Ontario, which was an early attempt to take a residential school and turn it into an Indigenous cultural center. And Trudy Nix, who was the sort of grand dame of the Royal Ontario Museum cultural pieces around the Indigenous. So Tom Hill and Trudy Nix were the co-chairs, and then they identified about 25 senior museum people from across Canada and about 25 Indigenous leaders. And remember, we're back in 1988, 9, and 90, and so there was not the identified Indigenous cultural presence that there is today. So you had really to work hard on getting museum professionals and Indigenous people, and they met in three groups. There was the Western group, which was the prairies in BC, the Central Canada group, which was the Ontario-Quebec group, and the Atlantic group. And again, this was before cell phones, before computers, and so it was all get together, get on the phone, come together and write letters and position papers and so on. So it was very intensive work. But what they really wanted to look at was aspects of forming partnerships, forming partnerships in museum governance, forming partnerships in developing exhibitions, which we had figured out when we did Where the Old Man Slept, but Glenbow had missed when they did Where the Spirit Sings. They did not consult the partners. Cultural properties, which for the Indigenous people are fraught with religious and spiritual significance and a lot of personal significance, because in the great anthropological debates at the turn of the last century, there was concern as to which was the superior race, the whites, the reds, the blacks, or the yellows. And so there was much anthropological material gathered. So you had lots of museums that had large collections of skeletal material with a lot of focus on this. And nobody was paying any attention to this material at the end of the century. It was just sitting on museum shelves. And finally, forming partnerships about interpretation. How does this get interpreted to people from different cultures? And access to collections. People had family pieces that were in museums that they had no access to.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing about the Field Museum when they started doing some of the repatriation of skeletal remains from the Field Museum. One of the elders from Haida Gwaii was down at the Field Museum, and they were being shown the boxes, bankers' boxes of bones that were going to be returned. And he realized that on the end of one of the boxes was his grandfather's name. And you can imagine how traumatic that would be for people. Who owned this material? Whose title was it? Training museum personnel, and the whole aspect as we globalized over the next 3 decades as to loaning material and ownership and exchanges. So this was all worked into the task force discussions, and they developed a set of protocols that came out of how to handle material, how to respect the cultural aspect, and how to be sensitive in interpretation and so on. And so out of this came a set of protocols, much like the calls to action that came out of the TRC 20 years later. And what was interesting there was that those protocols were adopted by the museums in Canada, and then the protocols were shared through the United Nations with UNESCO and became adopted worldwide. So when I say this was a significant event and significant move forward for museums, it really was. And as president of the Canadian Museums Association, I was very happy to see this all occurring. And as I said at the beginning, this was the most significant work that I was involved in the museum world. Interestingly enough, Red Deer and District Museum made a submission to the task force. And they made a submission based on the fact that we had consulted with the elders at Maskwacis Cultural College, that we had elders at the Red Deer and District Museum, and we had elders from the Native Friendship Center at Brockett, Alberta, to get the Blackfoot piece as well as the Cree piece. So on January the 6th, 1992, the report was released and adopted by ICOM, which is the International Committee of Museums. And that, to me, was a real accomplishment for the Canadian Museum Association, the Assembly of First Nations, and all of Canada. What followed that, 25 years later, was a conference in Kelowna. And the conference was sponsored by the British Columbia Cultural Department, the British Columbia Museums Association, and the Canadian Museums Association to see what was happening in museums in British Columbia post task force. In other words, 25 years later, what difference is it making? I made it my business to go to that conference because I was so pleased to know that there was a conference checking on how this was going. And I must say that it was really gratifying to hear. Not everything has been corrected, but a lot of it has been, where Indigenous people are now being consulted about collections and governance and interpretation, but most of all, repatriation. And there was a film that was shown that needs to be made available. It's called Stolen Spirits of Haida Gwaii.
Yeah.
And it's the story of the Field Museum and their huge repatriation of human remains to Haida Gwaii, and how significant that was to those people when they knew that those bankers' boxes of material were coming back to their territory. They made the traditional bentwood boxes, which really replicated the bankers' boxes, which is kind of eerie of itself. They made the beautiful bentwood boxes, decorated them with the beautiful stenciling that they do. And then they involved the school children because these were their ancestors. So they involved the children in making red blankets with the white pearl buttons on them. And then they wrapped the bone collections in the blankets, put them in the boxes, and buried them and gave them a proper ceremonial burial. And life goes on, but we've now got the repatriation thing clearly in our head. I was thrilled this year to know that after 130 years of a totem pole being stolen from a village in Haida Gwaii and sent to Scotland, it's spent 130 years in the museum in Scotland, and now it has come back to ceremony at Haida Gwaii. We've just had some headdresses returned to the Kainai people in southern Alberta, artifacts from museums in England and a lot in Germany have been returned, especially a number of pieces that were related to the 1887 signing of Treaty Number 7 at the Blackfoot Crossing.
Crowfoot's Church.
Yes, and some of this stuff has come back and is now in a wonderful interpretive center built at the Blackfoot Crossing to interpret the signing of the treaty and the traditional life of the Blackfoot people there and so on. And so the cry that has come out of a lot of the angst with Indigenous people in the last little while is nothing about us without us. Really encapsulates how museums now should be and are dealing with Indigenous material, where they consult with the Indigenous people, they build the exhibits, they build the labels and the text and the panels, and it's nothing about us without us. And that's quite a change when you think back 30 years to when museums were started with just a bit of a nod, if anything, to the Indigenous people. Basically, it was a museum of settlement. But now we have, for example, the Provincial Museum of Alberta. The whole first gallery is enormously devoted to the First Nations people of Alberta. And you could not visit that museum and not be absolutely informed and moved by the exhibits that are there. Whereas the Provincial Museum that opened in 1967, I remember vividly, you walked into the main entrance of this grand building, and there were two bronze sculptures that you were confronted with. The one on the left was a settler, his wife, and a child. And the one on the right were pronghorn antelope leaping on the prairie. So there was the settlers and there were the wildlife.
Yeah.
There were no indigenous people anywhere in that museum. That changed absolutely around. The museum now is a showcase of material, and we had the material all that time. In fact, to be quite honest, we had what was called the Browning collection, and it was a huge collection of anthropological material about the indigenous people of Browning, Montana, that area. They were all Blackfoot, and it was a huge collection. And we had it at the Provincial Museum. And then somebody from Browning said, "What are you doing with that? It's all in the back room." Nobody was doing anything with it. And so there was a whole questioning of, should we continue to hold that collection, or should we hold it and share it with Browning? I mean, this is getting into international work because Browning is in the US. So we've come a long way in all of that. And I think that in the spirit of sharing and being fair and honest, that's where we are now. And knowing that the TRC has put the call for within its 94 calls to action, specific ones to museums that say, there should be workers in museums with Indigenous background, training opportunities, access to those collections, especially for sensitive material, and maybe removing the really sensitive and sacred pieces from our collections, because we really don't need sacred material from the Indigenous community to be on a sterile museum shelf when it should be part of the families and the people who are there. And so we've learned that sensitivity, and it's no longer the carnival version of Indigenous life. It's a much more introspective and sensitive view. And so for the museum going forward, it would delight me to no end to see Indigenous advisors, members of the Indigenous community on our board of directors, so we get good governance from the beginning, that we acknowledge the Indigenous people in our exhibits, and that the interpretation we put on is that these are not people who used to be here.
Yeah.
They are still here. They're just in a slightly different form because we have changed the landscape, we have changed the population, but they are not exotic things to keep in glass cases. It's a living culture. And so that's why it thrills me to see the museum here having the exhibit of the regalia that you had a couple of years ago, the exhibit of artwork that's currently in the gallery, and the stone bowl as a recognition that, yes, the settlers came here and this thing is 100 years old and this is 120 years old, but that bowl is 6,400 years old. It predates anything that was here, and was part of a very active trade route through this part of the world. So it means that we have to be sensitive to the protocols that were developed and sensitive to the TRC calls to action.
Agree. I'd like to thank you for coming down and having this conversation with us today. It is such a pleasure to be able to sit here and listen and learn. And I really would like to thank you for that.
It was great to tell the story. And I realized that I am one of the few people left who was involved in that evolutionary piece, and consider myself fortunate to have been involved. And it's a great delight to share all of this with you. My only regret is that I can't do it in person with you all today. So I hope the film does that job.